Well, welcome to another Friday night. Last week I introduced the topic of the quest for happiness, and that every parent wants their child to be happy. Every culture, every country in the world, people have this built-in drive to find happiness. It's just part of what makes us who we are, but a lot of us get the wrong recipe for happiness. A lot of people are chasing happiness and not finding happiness. And so last week I told you a bit of my journey from where I started as a child and what I was taught about happiness, and then just piece by piece as I began to understand happiness with more and more factors and with a greater understanding. And I ended by saying that a formula has come out, and that's what I want to focus on today. So there's been a branch of psychology called positive psychology. It was developed by Martin Seligman in the late 1990s. And they've really just focused on what is positive psychology. How does a person get to a positive psychological place where they have true happiness? And they've sent people all over the world to do research and studies of every culture, religion, everything they can find to go, what is the recipe for happiness they use? What is the pros and cons? What can we take from that? And it's developed and led to this formula. And so I want to draw on Jonathan Haidt, who has written a book called Happiness Hypothesis, where he really kind of summarizes all of the research that has come in from positive psychology research into understanding what leads to genuine, lasting happiness. So he said the formula is H, which is happiness, equals S plus C plus V. So S is your biological set point. C is the conditions of your life, and V is your voluntary activities. So those three things all play a role in happiness. So the big picture is that there's certain external conditions that matter, many internal conditions that matter. So that's what I want to just explain and develop for you today. And I just think there's a ton of value that's come out of this research. It really aligns with kind of my journey and what I began to understand as I studied the 12 needs and complex trauma. So let's start with this S, the set point. And so we've seen for years now, neurobiology has shown us that how your brain function is determined by your genetics, your nature, but also by your upbringing and trauma, nurture. Both of those affect how your brain functions. It affects your brain chemicals, how your brain wires itself, and it also creates a default setting in your subconscious brain. And that's been so important to understand. And so what that basically says is your brain finds a set point. So some people just seem happier than others. They wake up happy, they wake up in a good mood. Others wake up kind of grumpy, kind of negative. Their set point is a wee bit different than other person's. Some people see the glass as half empty. Others see it as half full. Some are just a bit more optimistic. Others a bit more pessimistic than others. And so what they've seen is some people just seem to have a little bit greater capacity or tendency that leads towards happiness than others. What we see from complex trauma is that some people coming out of complex trauma actually have a default setting of sadness. Something in them, if they're not feeling sad or overwhelmed or defeated or down or depressed or anxious, they just feel something's wrong. Something's not right. That's because that was their normal for so many years that their brain just goes there and wants to be there to feel normal. So Jonathan Haidt says this: yes, genes explain far more about us than anyone realized. So when we first began to understand DNA and genetics, it was, wow, this is explaining so much. But initially we gave it a lot more weight than it probably should have got. We began to think genes would explain everything. But the genes, what we found out, and Jonathan Haidt says, turn out to be sensitive to environmental conditions. So we began to understand epigenetics, and we began to realize that trauma and stress and your environmental conditions, they begin to influence how genes express themselves. And so, yes, each person has a characteristic level of happiness, and you could explain some of that genetically, but it now looks as though it's not so much a set point as a potential range or probability distribution. So it's not like there's a set point and you're just stuck there. There's nothing you can do about it. It's more of a range. So whether you operate on the high or low side of your potential range is determined by many factors. In other words, you're not locked into some set point that could have been genetic but greatly influenced by trauma that would put you in a negative place. No, that would be the negative end of a range. Default settings can be changed. The brain can be rewired. Brain chemicals can be realigned. So your set point isn't kind of this fatalistic set point you can do nothing about. It's part of a range that you have a lot of influence over. So if you have a set point that is a little bit lower than others, what's important to understand is your set point doesn't play a huge factor in your overall deep happiness. It might cause you to be more sensitive to pleasure, more experiencing of pleasure, but the deep happiness part, the recipe for that, isn't so much influenced by the set point. So that's the one part of the equation. It is a part to be considered, but it's not the main issue. The main issue becomes C, the conditions of your life. This is the heart of it. This is really what we talked about last week with the meeting of the 12 needs. You have to have the right conditions to meet the 12 needs, the tools to do that, and to keep meeting them on an ongoing basis. That is really what the C is all about. And this, what we said last week, is where most people go wrong, because most people develop either unrealistic expectations that if they just meet one need, get the right conditions in one area, then they'll be happy. And they don't see there's multiple conditions that need to be met. There's many factors. And so this is where it's easy to go wrong in your recipe for happiness. And a lot of people focus on just external conditions, and there are external conditions, when the main issue, though, is getting the right internal conditions. So let me come at this from a couple different angles. A lot of people, they think if only I could change certain things, then I'd be happy. The problem is that they're trying to change things that they can't change. So here's some of the conditions that you can't change. You can't change your gender. You can't change your age. So it's no point to say, if only I was younger, or if only I was a different gender. You can't change your race. You can't change whether you have a disability. You can't change who your parents are, who your siblings are, who your family is. You can't change many of your physical characteristics. You can't change your basic personality. So whether you're an extrovert or an introvert, how you learn, how you process information, whether you're creative, analytical, artistic, that's how you're wired. That's built into you. You can't change that. So true happiness isn't dependent on those things. That's what I want you to see. Part of true happiness is accepting those things, that those you have as given conditions. Fighting against them, trying to change them, wishing you could change them, will only lead to lack of happiness. some of the things that you can change possibly that might help a little bit in your overall happiness, but aren't major factors, are your job. So if you're in a job that you're just don't enjoy, that can take its toll and begin to affect your happiness. So you might have some control over being able to change your job. Some people can't. They're just in a situation where there's no other jobs available. They don't have the skills to do other jobs. And so they're kind of stuck with having to do a certain job that they really don't enjoy. And so a key for them is finding happiness within less than ideal job condition. Your wealth, you might be able to increase your wealth, you might not. You might be resigned to being fairly poor, being middle class for the rest of your life. And part of happiness is accepting that. But in some cases, you can work to have a bit more income so that you could get some things that would add to a more pleasurable life. Your marital status, you can possibly have some control in changing that. Relationships, if you're in a bunch of relationships that are just toxic, you do have control. Those are conditions you can change. You can change some boundaries within relationships, with family, with friends, and that can possibly increase your happiness. So what most people find with external conditions are some you can't change, some maybe you can change, but a big requirement is learning to adapt. So if you are just part of a cold climate culture, you can't move, you can't afford to move, but you can adapt to a climate that's not warm. Or if you're just in a hot climate and you can't move, you can adapt to that. So we can adapt to tons of external environment conditions. That's the point. What's interesting is research has shown that there's 4 external conditions that we have a hard time adapting to and that really negatively affect happiness. So number 1 is noise. So research shows that people who must adapt to new and chronic sources of noise, such as a new highway being built, never fully adapt. And even studies that find some adaptation, so some can adapt a bit, but they still find evidence of impairment on cognitive tasks. And noise, especially noise that is variable or intermittent, interferes with concentration and increases stress. And that takes its toll on happiness. The second thing is commuting. So many people have moved out of kind of the city center to get out into the suburbs, to get to a bigger house, to get to more free space in their neighborhood, less crime, all of those things, but it now requires them to commute. And what they have found is that people quickly adapt to having more space, bigger yards, all of that, but they don't fully adapt to a longer commute, especially if it involves driving in heavy traffic. Even after years of commuting, those whose commutes are traffic-filled still arrive at work with higher levels of stress hormones. And that has a negative effect on happiness. Lack of control is another thing. And so there's something in us that needs a certain level of control to find happiness, to feel happy. If we feel totally powerless, totally helpless to change our world, to influence our world, it has a negative effect on our happiness. So Ellen Langer, in a study with Judith Roden, they did 2 things with residents of a nursing home. So they gave benefits to residents on 2 floors of a nursing home. So plants in their rooms, movie screening 1 night a week. But the difference was on 1 floor, the benefits came with a sense of control. The residents were allowed to choose the plants they wanted, and were responsible for watering them. They were allowed to choose as a group which night would be a movie night and what movie they wanted to watch. On the other floor, the same benefits were simply doled out. The nurses chose the plants and watered them. The nurses decided which movie to watch and on what night. So this small change had a huge effect. On the floor with increased control, where they could decide the plants, they had to water them, what movie to watch, what night to watch it, the residents were happier, more active, more alert, and that was rated by both the nurses and the residents. And those benefits were still visible 18 months later. Most amazingly, at the 18-month follow-up, residents on the floor given control had better health and half as many deaths. So again, having some form of control is critical. The fourth condition that they're finding in the research is so significant towards happiness is the condition of intimate relationships. So the condition that is usually said to trump all others in important is the strength and number of a person's relationships. Good relationships make people happy, and happy people enjoy more and better relationships than unhappy people. Conflicts in relationships is one of the surest ways to reduce your happiness, especially if the conflicts remain unresolved and are quite frequent. You never adapt to interpersonal conflict. It damages every day, even days when you don't see the other person, you're still thinking about the conflict, and that's messing up your happiness. So we talked about this last week, that connection, safe, healthy connection with safe people where you're resolving conflicts well is so essential to happiness. When that is not happening, has a huge negative effect on your happiness. So those are external conditions. Now let me talk about significant internal conditions that hinder your happiness. Shame, and that comes out of complex trauma. So people with shame, especially the deeper the shame, the less capable they are of being happy because they just don't like themselves. People who aren't able to connect. It's not just that they don't have the opportunity to connect, it's that they don't have the tools to connect. They have insecure attachment issues. That greatly affects their ability to have happiness. People who don't feel they can be authentic. They feel that if they're authentic, they'll be rejected, abandoned. And so they always have to wear masks and play roles and be codependent and alert to everybody else's need, but not their own. Those people have great difficulty with happiness. People who all of their life have not felt seen or understood. That has a profound negative effect on happiness. People who've responded to their shame by feeling they have to be perfect. And so they develop perfectionistic, unrealistic, unrelenting standards. That has a huge negative effect on happiness. People that live with constant fear and anxiety, that comes out of complex trauma. That has a negative effect on happiness. People who live with constant, unresolved anger, deep lava type anger, and they're just negative, irritable, critical, judgmental, that has a profound negative effect on happiness. People that have developed a very victim mentality, full of self-pity, always feeling sorry for themselves, that has a profound negative effect on happiness. People that just blame everybody for their problems, that deny their own part, deny a lot of problems, that has a negative effect on happiness. People who live with a guilty conscience struggle with happiness. Guilty conscience is that alarm system within us that says that we're doing something that violates love. So we're lying, we're being dishonest to others, we're betraying others, we're cheating from others, we're stealing from others, we're hurting others in some way. If we're doing that and we're not owning it, we're not being sorry, we're not changing, we continue to do that kind of stuff, our conscience will bother us. It will create internal pain, a disquiet, a lack of peace. True happiness can't exist there. And so it's so important to realize that to have happiness, we have to have a clear conscience, which means we have to live in harmony with love and justice. If we're not living in harmony with love and justice, we're not going to have true happiness. And that then means that to have true happiness, there has to be true humility. Now, I've done a whole talk on what is true humility because there's so much misunderstanding about it, but that is an ingredient of true happiness. So we're getting to those deep internal attitudes: humility, love, justice, clear conscience, accepting myself, connecting to others. All of that, so essential. Now, what's come out of all of this research is some of the major challenges that we all have when it comes to happiness. Challenges that we need to be aware of and on top of all the time if we're going to maintain happiness. So the first challenge is our brain. And we've talked about this in other videos, our limbic brain versus our cortex brain and the war that goes on between them. So Jonathan Haidt has written this: modern theories about rational choice and information processing don't adequately explain the weakness of the will. So we can figure out all the things we should do, but the problem is often we still don't do it. And there's not been an adequate explanation for many years about that. It's just, well, you just need more willpower. And that hasn't been good enough. So the old metaphors about controlling animals work beautifully. So he says this: the image that I came up with for myself as I marveled at my own weakness was that I was a rider, which is the cortex of the brain, on the back of an elephant, which is the limbic brain. I'm holding the reins in my hands, and by pulling one way or the other, I can tell the elephant to turn, to stop, or to go. I can direct things, but only when the elephant doesn't have desires of his own. So in other words, when the limbic brain and the cortex are in agreement and they both want the same thing, man, we are a smooth running machine. But when the limbic brain is in disagreement and wants to do something different from the cortex, the rider, we got problems. So when the elephant really wants to do something, I'm no match for him. To understand most important ideas in psychology, you need to understand how the mind is divided into parts that sometimes conflict. We assume that there is one person in each body, but in some ways we are much more like a committee whose members have been thrown together to do a job, but who often find themselves working at cross purposes. So our limbic brain and our cortex are great when they are in agreement, but when they are not in agreement, we get pulled in two directions. And as long as that remains unresolved, we will not be happy. So the limbic brain is only concerned about short-term consequences. The cortex is concerned, it's the wise brain, it's concerned about long-term consequences, what is healthy in the long run. The limbic brain, what gives me instant gratification, what makes me feel good now. It thinks only in terms of short term. So the limbic brain is affected by complex trauma the most because the limbic brain is also responsible for safety. That's a short-term thing. It's the emotional center as well. So complex trauma causes a person to live out of their limbic brain. The cortex doesn't develop properly. And as a result of that, the limbic brain becomes the driver of the vehicle, but it is influenced by short-term thinking, instant gratification. I just want to be safe and feel safe now, feel good now. I don't care about long-term consequences. I don't care about whether this is really healthy. But more than that, the limbic brain becomes dominated by negative emotions. It doesn't have the normal feel-good emotions that a healthy child would have. The complex trauma causes to feel emptiness, pain, anxiety, fear, anger as the predominant emotions. And they don't pull a person in a healthy direction. Complex trauma causes you now to go to fight or flight or dissociation, freeze. It pulls you to pull away from people, to hide yourself, to hate yourself. It pulls you in all negative directions. And so what you find now is the limbic brain has actually become a very unhealthy, self-destructive force that we now fight against. And it pulls us away from happiness. It thinks it's pulling us towards happiness because it's pulling us towards instant gratification, but it's pulling us towards things that are very unhealthy in the long term. So a huge challenge for people from complex trauma in finding happiness is healing the limbic brain, learning to let the cortex ride the elephant and learn how to handle the elephant when it gets triggered. There's a second challenge, and that is our bodies. We have bodies that, because of trauma, have chronic illness, chronic pain, chronic fatigue, and that takes its toll on happiness. We have bodies that as we get older, they have limitations, they get more tired, they have more pain, and that takes its toll on happiness. We have hormones within our body that create desires that trigger our limbic brain, that pull us to make unwise decisions that can actually work against happiness. They give instant gratification, but not long-term happiness. So we have bodies that we live in that can greatly affect our happiness. Next week, I'm going to talk about how trauma affects the body, but one of the things it does is that we disconnect from the body, and how that can have, without even realizing it, effects on being able to experience happiness to the fullest. Then we're emotional beings, and our emotions present huge challenges with happiness. And complex trauma greatly affects that negatively. So we experience many emotions that are very painful, very intense, very negative. Now, if you're in a set of circumstances where you're getting negative emotions, negative, painful emotions that are very intense, and there's no quick way to resolve them, and that's your predominant emotional state, you don't get a lot of positive emotions happening, that gradually takes its toll. That is going to wear you down. More than that, the result of some experiences is that you live with emotions that you just can't resolve quickly. So you lose somebody close to you. You go through grief. You don't just resolve that in a week. That could go on for months and years before you can get out the other side of that. You can go through deep hurt, deep emotional pain that you just can't resolve quickly. And so the result of that is you're forced to sit in negative emotions for quite a period of time. And if you get too much of that happening, that begins to be a huge challenge to happiness. But then there's a fourth thing, your mental health. So people who struggle with major depression, major anxiety, they struggle to find happiness. But that mental health stuff is massive as far as a challenge when it comes to happiness. Then there's a fourth thing. We live in a world that has many things that are appealing to our limbic brain. They offer instant gratification. So if you just eat more chocolate, if you just sit around all day and just are lazy and go on a Netflix binge fest, you'll be happy. It'll give you instant gratification. If you just play this video game all day, that'll make you happy. All of those things that appeal to our limbic brain, they have this gravitational force, magnetic attraction to us. We are drawn to want to do them because they make us feel good now, but they have long-term consequences that are harmful, that work against happiness long-term. So the reality of living in this world is we live in a world that has many things that become temptations to our limbic brain. So we're constantly having our limbic brain triggered, wanting to do something because it'll give instant gratification. And we have to bring in our cortex and say, no, I'm not going to do that because that'll have long-term consequences that work against happiness. But we got to live in that world and fight these temptations all the time. And we can go through times where it just seems like every day there's 50 temptations that pull at us, and it's a constant war. But then we live in a culture that every culture has some aspects of the recipe for happiness that are accurate, but some aspects that are not accurate. And in the West, we happen to live in a culture that has really developed a recipe for happiness that appeals to the limbic brain. And so much of the advertising and the millions of dollars that get spent on advertising that are part of our culture are designed to appeal to the limbic brain, instant gratification focus. If you just have this car, if you just have this house, if you just have this amount of sex, if there's this pretty partner, then you'll be happy. All of that is part of our culture that we're bombarded with every day. And so finding happiness is learning to live within that culture without succumbing to the pressure of that culture. And that is not easy. But then there's the challenge of responsibility. So being part of a healthy human adult means accepting responsibilities. But the danger is, as we go through life, at times our responsibilities change and they increase. We have children, we get a new job, we get new volunteer responsibilities. All of that adds to our stress. And often it can add to our stress without us realizing it, or without us being able to resolve that stress quickly to get to a safe stress, healthy stress state. When we're in a too much stress state for too long, it activates our stress system, which activates our sympathetic nervous system, and that's not good for us. Because true happiness is only experienced when we're in our parasympathetic nervous system. When we're in an activated stress state, we can experience pleasure, but we can't experience that deep, peaceful happiness state. The final challenge for many people in our world today is being in unsafe environments, and they're helpless to do anything to change it. So people that are in war zones right now, people that are in unsafe neighborhoods with gangs, and they're just too poor to move, or the government won't let them move. What do you do with that? That takes its toll. That is so challenging. Or people who are in cultures where all of a sudden there's a spike in racism. There's a increased hatred for certain types of people. And you're one of those people that all of a sudden there's a deeper hatred towards you. That is so difficult, and there's nothing you can do to resolve that. So those are the conditioned stuff. So bottom line again is it's learning to meet your 12 needs. So there's an external environment of safety and conditions that are necessary, yes, but it's getting those internal things cared for and met. The fourth thing, V, in this formula, volunteer activities. And what they're finding is this is the activities that we choose to engage in that give us a sense of purpose, that give us a sense of fulfillment, that take us to something bigger than just meeting our own needs, indulging our own desires. Takes us out of ourselves. It's bigger than ourselves. And it's finding the activities that match our deepest passions and gifts and abilities. And so when a person finds this place where their volunteer activities matches their deepest passions and gifts, it's like they enter a zone. They're in what they call the flow state. So it's a state of total immersion in a task that is challengingly closely matched to your abilities. Flow often occurs during physical movement, so skiing, driving fast on a curvy country road, or playing team sports. So you'll hear athletes that talk about being in the zone. Everything slows down for them. They're in the flow. Flow can be aided by music or by the action of other people, both of which provide a temporal structure for one's behavior. So singing in a choir, dancing, intense conversation with a friend. You're just all of a sudden in that sweet spot, that zone. Flow can happen during solitary creative activities such as painting or writing or photography. So you get in that zone and all of a sudden you lose track of time. It's just that sweet, sweet place. So the keys to flow are, it's a clear challenge that engages your attention. You have the skills to meet that challenge, and you get immediate feedback about how you're doing at each step in meeting this challenge. So you get flash after flash of positive feeling with each turn negotiated, each high note correctly sung, each brushstroke that falls in the right place. It's a constant reward system that's happening as you tackle each aspect so well. You're in the zone. So what all of this is saying at a bigger picture is volunteer activities is learning to balance my life with the right amount of self-care and the right amount of loving others. So it's about love. I have to learn to love myself and meet my 12 needs, but I also have to learn to love others. There has to be a balance of those two things. What's important to understand is our limbic brain, which is our child brain, is often narcissistic. It thinks that the key to happiness is indulging my desires. It's being selfish. It's getting whatever I want. It's being my own boss, doing my own thing. It's all about me. That's the basic starting point for many people, for a recipe for happiness, and sadly, for many who become narcissistic, that's their ongoing recipe for happiness. People that grow into their cortex, that become wiser, they have learned that, yes, I need self-love that's healthy, that meets my needs in healthy ways. But I also need to learn to love. I have to get out of myself. I have to give to others as well. There's something about happiness that means loving self, loving others must be in balance. Now, it's important to say that learning to love isn't just about loving self and loving others. Volunteer activities can also learning to love my world, love animals. Love in general is not just about people, it's about creatures. It's about the environment. It's about the world we live in. All of those play a key role. So that's the happiness formula. I hope that helps you. I hope it just maybe validates for you that you're on the right path, that there's a load of research being done that's all just pointing to this formula and what we've been talking about. And I hope that in this year you will grow in your experience of happiness, your capacity for happiness, that you will find true happiness.